Hello everybody, I hope the new year's going well for all of you so far. As some of you will know, I've been keeping up to date with the competition that I ran. Big Banana Brewing won it again, and I will therefore be brewing a beer for him. So this video is basically, because of the nature of the brief that he gave me, about how I'm going to come up with the recipe for that beer, which we've decided is going to be a Belgian IPA. So yeah, let's go through the process of coming up with that recipe and see how it works out. Right, so let's have a look at that brief that Stephen gave me. It's pretty open-ended. He basically said, do a style you haven't done before, or even use hops you haven't tried before combined with a new yeast as well. Like an IPA with a Belgian IPA yeast, which is where the Belgian IPA idea came from, or a stout with a Vermont ale yeast, something like that. The world is your lobster, rodders, go for it. We did establish subsequently that he was probably pissed when he wrote that comment based on the finishing line there. So essentially it was make a beer using some ingredients that you haven't used, and the suggestion of an IPA with a Belgian yeast basically appealed to me because I haven't really made, well, I have made a Belgian beer, but literally just bottled it the other day and it's in the fridge, so I haven't used hardly any Belgian yeast apart from the one that went in that, which was a CML dried Belgian yeast. And that also gives me the opportunity to throw in some new hops as well that I haven't used before. So that's what we went for. I thought that I would probably go for European hops, so some of the newer European hop varieties, so make it more of a Belgian interpretation of an IPA rather than just an American IPA that's got Belgian yeast shoved into it. So Belgian yeast and new European hops, so hitting the brief there in terms of new yeast, new hops that I haven't tried before, and hopefully making something that's quite interesting and ideally drinkable as well, although it's probably quite a tricky style to try and take on, especially for somebody who's not really experienced with Belgian beers generally. I've been trying to drink quite a few commercial examples recently to try and educate myself a little bit in Belgian beers before I try and brew a few of them. My personal taste is more for the sort of drier, slightly less kind of estery or phenolic styles, so more the kind of strong golden ales, triples and so on, which aren't too crazy in terms of the yeast flavours. So a Belgian IPA is kind of down that avenue, and probably quite similar to a strong golden ale, but basically with more hopping in there. So hopefully it should be something that I like, and if it isn't, I'm sending most of it to Stephen anyway, so he'll have to drink it. Okay, so where to start with this recipe? Basically, as I said, I don't really know a huge amount about brewing Belgian beers generally, and especially not Belgian IPA. There's not necessarily a huge amount of information out there, so I thought I'd do a bit of research first of all, which is always a good starting point if it's a style that you're not familiar with or you're doing something a little bit experimental like this. Didn't find much in the books that I've got. I've got quite a few brewing books, but there wasn't a huge amount. Well, hardly any of them had anything that was specifically a Belgian IPA. The one that I did find that had a Belgian IPA recipe in it was this one, so Radical Brewing by Randy Mosher. I think that they say Mosher when I hear his name on like the American podcast and stuff, but I read that as Mosher. And his recipe is basically mostly Pilsner malt, a fair wedge of crystal malt for an IPA, so he's got 13% crystal malt in there, and then a I think the recipe as it's written in the book is actually a little bit inaccurate in terms of what he was intending, because it's basically got Liberty hops and then a load of SARS, about 180 grams of hops in total, so a good sort of amount for a typical IPA there for a 19-litre batch, but just Liberty and SARS hops. But in the description he does talk about mixing European and American hops, so throwing in something like Chinook or Artemum. He also mentions possibly adding a little bit of grapefruit peel or something like that to add some fruitiness, and fermenting it with your favourite Belgian yeast. So it's not a huge amount to go on there, but Pilsner malt, mixture of hops. It was a bit of a starting point. 1060 gravity to give 4.9 to 5.6 ABV. I would be looking for something a little bit higher than that, and bitterness of about 49 IBU. So pretty much within the realms of a typical IPA. So the books didn't throw up a huge amount, but got a little bit of info out of there. So then I went to the internet and started looking for some articles on Belgian IPAs, and probably one of the better ones that I found was on Craft Beer and Brewing magazine website, beerandbrewing.com. Make your best Belgian IPA. So I will put a picture of that up, or link to that up at the bottom as well. And this had some more detailed information in there in terms of how to approach it. So choice of yeast strain and hop varieties is critical, because many will horribly clash. So what I was saying in terms of this being quite a tricky recipe to take on, basically comes from that, mixing big kind of fruity hops with a sort of spicy phenolic yeast strain is probably going to be quite difficult in terms of getting it to taste nice. And then in terms of ingredients, gives you a bit of information about the sort of stuff that they would put into it. So again, Pilsner malt as the base malt, Vienna malt, and a mixture of Victory and biscuit malt in there as well, about a pound of that in total. So that was actually pretty close to the recipe in terms of the grist that I'd already used for the Belgian beer that I've got that's just been bottled in the fridge behind me. So I thought I'd basically take that grist and just adapt it slightly for this IPA, make it a little bit simpler. So I went with the Pilsner malt, again, floor malted Weyermann Pilsner malt, so a really nice base malt there to start with. About nearly 800 grams of Munich, so that's about 28% of the grist, bearing in mind that this is just on a 10 litre recipe batch size that I'm doing at the moment. When I'm doing something a bit experimental like this, I don't generally start off with a full-sized kind of 19 or 23 litre batch, just in case it's horrendous. So about 28% Munich, and then we've got just a small amount of aromatic. So I use some of this in that Belgian that I've just made, just under 5% aromatic malt. So I want just a little bit of interest in the grist. It's basically a caramel malt, so it will also bring a little bit of sweetness there and a bit more body, and some sugar just to help basically boost the ABV up and give it a nice sort of dry finish, get it fermented down nice and low. So that was the grist. Then if we go back to our article, this one focused a lot on combining American and European hops. So as I said, I wanted to kind of keep it with the newer European hops in this, rather than just throwing big fruity American hops in it, partly because they're ones that I haven't used, so fitting the brief that I originally got, and also just to maybe keep it a little bit more, I don't know, European in character overall. Not that it really matters that it's authentic in that way, but they're the main sort of hops that I haven't really used very much at all. So I was looking for hops to meet the European but new and fruity characteristics. So I went with Hallertau Blanc and Mandarina Bavaria. We did talk about possibly looking at the yellow sub hop blend but in the end I fancied sort of trying these two out, so that's what we went with. Nice descriptions for both of these. Hopefully they will blend quite well, and more importantly, hopefully they will blend quite nicely with the yeast. Which takes us neatly on to the yeast itself. Now with this, I took quite a bit of time kind of looking at the different strains of Belgian yeast. As I said, I'm not really a massive fan of the kind of really strong phenolic, spicy yeast flavours that you get sometimes with Belgian beer. So I wanted something that was fairly restrained, and that also seemed like a good idea for an IPA, where you want it, although it needs to have that Belgian character for it to be a Belgian IPA, I guess you want it to be fairly restrained so that you can still get that hop flavour coming through and have it relatively clean in terms of the finish. So I read up on a few of them, and I kind of narrowed it down to two types that I thought might work quite well. The first was the one that was actually recommended in the Beer and Brewing magazine article, which is the Belgian Ardennes yeast. The equivalent to that in terms of White Labs is WLP 550. So the Duvel yeast, which is WLP 570, Belgian Golden Ale yeast, was the other one that I thought might be a good option. Strong golden ales, probably pretty close to an IPA in terms of the sort of characteristics that you're looking for. Good attenuation, not necessarily the strongest in terms of the kind of esters and spiciness that comes from it. So both of those looked to me like probably good options in terms of something that I could maybe ferment at a lower temperature and get a relatively clean ferment out that was going to also attenuate the beer well and hopefully produce a good Belgian IPA. Not too crazy in terms of sort of fruity esters, and yeah, basically suited to styles that should be comparable to what you're looking for in an IPA. So in the end, I went with the WLP 550. I ordered a few bits from the malt miller, and they didn't have 570 in stock. I might have gone with that one as my first preference, but they didn't have it, so I went with the 550 as that was recommended in the article that I read, and hopefully that will do a good job. In terms of the characteristics listed by White Labs, very good attenuation, 78 to 85%, so it should really dry the beer out nicely, give you that nice IPA finish and dryness to it. The flocculation is given as medium, although in a lot of the reviews people do talk about it being very good at clearing, so it should drop out nice and clear as well. Very high alcohol tolerance, so well, they say medium to high, but 8 to 12% is very high as far as I'm concerned, and a temperature range between 68 and 78 degrees, so definitely got the option there to ferment it on the cooler side and hopefully get a slightly cleaner ferment from it. Generally good reviews for it. It does say that it's more on the spicy side as opposed to the fruity side, which again, I think if I can keep that slightly restrained, then that should work better than a really like fruity yeast for an IPA, although I might be totally wrong. We'll have to wait and see. So that's kind of the key to it. That's the main thing that's making it a Belgian IPA. That's the yeast, which we've gone with there. So that kind of covers it really. So let's have a look at the overall recipe again. We've got our basic grist there, Pilsner Munich, aromatic malt and a bit of Demerara sugar, and then hallertau blanc for bittering, a bit more of that at 10 minutes, bit more of mandarina Bavaria at 5 minutes, so lots of late hops going in. Not a ridiculous amount in terms of IPA hopping, but I don't want to completely overwhelm the beer with the hops, but equivalent to about 200, just over 200 grams if we were looking at a full size batch, which is still a decent amount for an IPA as far as I'm concerned. So combination of the hallertau and mandarina at flame out, and then we'll do another addition of hops for the dry hop, again half and half hallertau and mandarina. Numbers comes out with an OG of 1062 based on 70% efficiency. If I'm doing this as a stovetop brew, that's about typical efficiency that I'll be looking at. IBU's 57, which puts it nicely into the range given by Beersmith for a Belgian IPA. The bitterness ratio 0.918, so I'd normally shoot for with an IPA of any kind a bitterness ratio of somewhere between 0.9 and, well, somewhere over 1, I guess, depending on whether you're looking at, you know, big IPA, double IPA or something, you might go a bit higher, but for a standard IPA, probably between 0.9 and 1.1 I'd normally look for. Colour, it's an IPA which has pale ale in the description, so fairly light, 14.7 EBC, and then the ABV, if it dries out as much as Beersmith believes it will, it should finish at 1.007, which will give us approximately 7.2% ABV, so a nice pokey little number there. So that's the recipe. Hopefully some of my justification for that makes sense. If you've got any contributions to make or opinions on the ideas there, then do feel free to comment. I may or may not take your advice or completely ignore you, but do please get involved and throw some ideas out there if you've got anything to contribute. And quite looking forward to brewing this one now, so it should be an interesting beer. Hopefully it won't be a complete disaster. I think, you know, I've hopefully put enough thought into this to avoid most of the pitfalls that are potentially there. We shall see. Okay, so thanks for watching, and I'll be back with a brew day video for this when I get it in the kettle. Okay, cheers guys.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, you know, that or his dudeness or duder or you know, El Duderino.